Welcome to Straight Talk with my OBMD podcast. Join me for a bi-weekly discussion on topics most relevant to women's health today. We are your source for medically accurate, real-world advice and all things related to your health and well-being as a woman. From menses to menopause, we've got you covered. I'm your host, Dr. Dana Smith, a fully practicing, board-certified OBGYN physician with close to 20 years experience. I am also the founder of the website that is 100% dedicated to women's health, myobmd.org. At myobmd.org, we write on all aspects related to women's health. Listen to our podcast, visit our website, subscribe to our newsletter, and follow us on Facebook and Instagram, myobmd.org. And let's take a moment to talk about PCOS. PCOS, as most of you know, it's polycystic ovarian syndrome, and it's syndrome. So a syndrome means that it affects more than one organ system. So meaning that it, even though it's called polycystic ovarian syndrome, it affects your ovary, but it also affects your endocrinological system, your circulatory system. It affects a different organ system. And just so everyone knows, PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, is a topic that has been covered on myobmd.org. We have extensive articles as well as educational video on PCOS, as well as previous podcast episodes that has discussed PCOS, because it's such an important topic, and it's really something that a lot of people are craving information on. And we've previously discussed how you are diagnosed with PCOS. It's a triad. It involves irregular cycles, signs of excessive testosterone levels, which can be anything ranging from acne, as Dr. Chappell has stated, to just some skin changes. So it's quite extensive, and it can be quite bothersome. It can be quite bothersome, and it's not just bothersome in the sense that it's a nuisance to you, because we know that patients who has PCOS can go on to develop heart disease at an earlier stage in life. And so there are medical consequences of having PCOS. So we just want to recognize the link between having what Dr. Chappell has spoken of with the having insulin resistance and PCOS. So with insulin resistance, that's often goes hand in hand with PCOS. So tell us a little bit about how, if someone is concerned that they may have insulin resistance, how would they go about getting diagnosed? Because I can tell you that as a physician, we often, for years, for decades, probably for centuries, we first just focused on diabetes, right? And then when I was in training and you started focusing on, well, there's pre-diabetes, right? So then we started testing more for pre-diabetes, and that still involves testing your hemoglobin A1C, right? So the hemoglobin A1C value is still a marker, and also the glucose levels are still a marker that is used in medicine to test, again, for diabetes or pre-diabetes. Now you are proposing that the medical community also check the insulin levels. So tell us a little bit about how the practicality of that. Are we doing that as part of a diabetes screening? Are we doing that as part of we are recognizing insulin resistance as its own entity and now doing testing based on, hey, I'm testing for insulin resistance separate and distinct from diabetes?
I think first and foremost is, the medical community, and that includes research, that includes physicians,
Mm-hmm.
they think of diabetes as being a glucose problem, but
Mm-hmm.
diabetes is an insulin problem. You either don't make enough insulin and your glucose levels rise, or you make too much insulin and it just doesn't work very well and your glucose rise. But if you have elevated glucose, you don't know which camp you're in. You just, if
Mm-hmm.
you have an A1C that's high, you don't know if it's because they're not making enough insulin or if they're making too much insulin. So
Mm-hmm.
there's no context behind that A1C number. Does that make sense? And so
Mm-hmm.
it's like buying a house and just looking at the walls to see
Mm-hmm.
whether or not there's cracks, to see what if the foundation is healthy. Well, you don't know,
Okay.
right?
Right.
You can just slap some paint over those cracks, but that's not fixing the foundation.
Mm-hmm.
And so the foundation is really understanding, well, how much insulin are they having to secrete in order to keep that blood sugar normal?
Mm-hmm.
Or is their pancreas like given out and they're not making enough insulin? So
Mm-hmm.
it's impossible to have that context without testing for insulin. So there was a really great study done where they took these 5-year-olds
Mm-hmm.
and they just gave them finger pricks and tested their blood at the age of 5. And this was in JAMA Pediatrics, and they followed them. And what they found was that you can find out if somebody is going to have, based on insulin levels, to predict whether somebody's going to have early onset diabetes, if they're going to have obesity, early puberty, just by testing insulin at the age of 5, because that's how fast it actually starts rising the
Mm-hmm.
day you're born. So, so what you would do is to test it. First things first, if you have a patient come in, you would want to test a fasting insulin. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's unfortunate to have to do fasting tests. I know A1C is so easy because you don't have to do it fasting, but the reality is that if this patient comes in or you could do it this way. Patient comes in and says, I have all these symptoms. You test her and say, well, all your labs came back normal, which probably sounds very familiar because I'm sure you have lots of patients
Right.
that I can't lose weight. I have acne. I'm losing my hair. I don't have irregular, I have irregular cycles. You do her lab workup and everything's normal. And
Mm-hmm.
then she's like, well, something's wrong. That's probably means her insulin's too high. So then I
Mm-hmm.
would say, I'm going to have you do a fasting insulin. Now, I want to give the caveat to this because a fasting insulin just says, whether their insulin's been so high all day that the liver is even able to clear it out of the bloodstream overnight, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
if it's so high, the liver might actually, it struggles to clear that out of the bloodstream overnight, which is why you would wake up and have a high fasting. Some patients, now this is rare with PCOS, but some patients who are young have a very well-functioning liver, and they
Mm-hmm.
can clear that insulin out of the blood overnight. But if it comes back normal or even just high normal, I would say then it's when you start doing the oral glucose tolerance test, because 9.9 times out of 10, what you're going to see on that is these patients cause massive oversecretion of insulin after a glucose load. And that is so telling because that is why they're struggling so much with their weight. Every time they're eating, they're sending 3, 4, 5, 10 times more insulin out, and it's just storing all that as fat. So, so you can just run an insulin. You can just order insulin like an A1C.
Mm-hmm. So are you saying when you have someone, they drink the glucose tolerance test, so you give them the carbohydrate load, which is the drink, and then you check their blood glucose hourly thereafter.
Just
Now,
one time, 2 hours after.
okay, so you're saying to check the glucose level or the insulin levels thereafter?
Both.
Both. Okay.
Because
Okay.
one, you can't understand one without the other. You
Mm-hmm.
know, if I mean, it's just really hard. You really need to have both because they work together in
Mm-hmm.
tandem. And so I think that you would order an oral glucose tolerance test with insulin.
Gotcha.
And
Okay.
and some patients are going to say, I don't care, or I don't want to know that, or I'm not going to come in for that test, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's different patients, but some patients are going to be like, tell me, I need to know what's wrong with me. I want
Mm-hmm.
to do whatever labs I need to do to know what's wrong with me. And if that's what I need to do, that's what I need to do. Um, and so this is one of the reasons why we made at-home insulin testing kits available, was because for patients who don't have the ability to take off work or whatnot, they can just do
Mm-hmm.
these tests at home in their PJs, and made that available for patients who wanted to have that.
And that sampling at home, is that still blood or is that some other bodily fluid?
It's blood. It comes with the kit comes with a packet of the 75 grams of dextrose. Um,
Okay.
and it comes with several finger lancets, and then it comes with the blood spot card, and it has fasting. You put your fasting blood here and your 2 hour blood here, and
Mm-hmm.
full explanation of everything. And then
Mm-hmm.
it comes with a
Okay.
prepaid label that they overnight to the lab, and then they get their
Okay.
results. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's awesome. I think that's beneficial. And of course, I always encourage patients to know their numbers. So once you have the testing done, certainly you should speak with your doctor, have a discussion regarding what the labs show. And just like I know you prefer going by Ali. So just like Ali says, even if your number this year is at a certain value, you'll know, hey, next year you can recognize, even if it's still within the normal value, you can see if there's a trend. And so that's something that your doctor, especially if you're changing doctors, they may not necessarily pick up on that, hey, there's a trend here because you may have had the testing done at one facility last year, and this year you're now with another facility. So it's always good for you as the patient to know your numbers so you can know, oh, this is what my levels were close to this last year, and now it's kind of it's still in the normal value, but it's going up.
Right.
So that's always good for the patients to know. Now, at home, let's say the patient is unaware of they're not sure. Let's talk about some of what they may be seeing clinically, meaning that when they look in the mirror, what are some of the things that we can that they can focus on, if you wouldn't mind going through that.
Right. So if they have PCOS, even if they don't have PCOS, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if they don't have PCOS, the most common symptoms of insulin resistance are weight gain and difficulty losing weight. Insulin affects serotonin and dopamine, which can affect their sleep. So sleep,
Mm-hmm.
people having issues with their sleep, their mood, because dopamine obviously and serotonin are important for mood, and then chronic fatigue and just general always hungry, craving carbs. That's symptoms for anyone with insulin resistance. But if
Mm-hmm.
you have PCOS, other symptoms are going to be some of these clinical symptoms. Remember that insulin is what's driving those androgens and the testosterone production. So if you have acne, if
Mm-hmm.
you are having facial hair growth, if you're losing scalp hair, acanthosis or the reddening of the skin or the velvety red dark patches around the neck,
Mm-hmm.
can be anywhere, but a lot of times it's around the neck. And irregular cycles. Remember that all of those are associated with high androgen levels, and those androgen levels are directly related to how high your insulin is.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's what's important to know. It doesn't matter what symptom you're having, the underlying cause of that is
Mm-hmm.
insulin resistance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And for the physicians on the call, healthcare
Mm-hmm.
providers,
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to mention earlier
Sure.
that the normal value for insulin is less than 8. It needs to be less than 8 microunits per milliliter.
Mm-hmm.
That's not usually on the lab range that comes from the lab. Usually it says up to 30, but 30 is excessive insulin resistance. You really want it to be less than 8. So that's
Okay.
really, really important for you to jot down and keep as a note.
I got you. Okay, okay. And I didn't ask because I figured you would have it would be lab dependent and the lab would give you the values. But if you're saying, the lab values are just you're not going to hit an abnormal until it's exceedingly high,
Yes.
then we need to know that. It is unfortunate though, because the treatment that goes along with it and the additional testing that goes along with it, often us as physicians, we have to justify to the insurance company, right? Why are you doing this? Why are you ordering, even if you're ordering exercise therapy or you're ordering a consultation with a dietitian, and they're going to look at these values and say, well, look at the lab, according to the lab values, these are normal values, so it really does speak to the need for our industry to really have real life standards, right? That are applicable to most human beings and not just these laboratory values that are
Yeah.
just,
Because they're not evidence-based. Right? When you
mhm,
go to the literature and you find so many of these studies that have stratified patients based on their fasting insulin, once they get over 8, the increased risk for all different chronic diseases goes up substantially.
mm, mhm,
And you're
mhm,
going to find these patients, I just went to Nurse Practitioners and Women's Health Conference, and I had
mhm,
a nurse practitioner come up and she goes, it's so interesting that you're talking about this because I just had a patient and she asked me to test her insulin and I'd never done that before and I didn't want to. She's like,
mm,
I've never done that. I didn't know what I was going to say if her insulin came back, high because there's no treatment to give her and
mhm,
I just didn't want to do it, but I did it anyways. And she said, and guess what? That girl came back, her A1C was 5.3,
which is
her
normal.
insulin was 72.
Mm,
I've never even heard it higher than 50. I've
mhm,
never heard of that. Like in our studies, patients' average was 31, which again is
mm,
excessively high, but a 72. And she
mhm.
said this patient was a BMI of 50
Oh my
at an
goodness.
A1C of 5.3. And she's
Mhm,
like, and I kept telling her, your labs are normal. I don't know what to tell you.
mhm,
Your labs are normal.
mhm,
And so she said, finally, I did this and I got that number. And I was like, oh my gosh, why did I test this? Now I have no idea what to tell. Because that's
mhm,
not taught to the med,
mhm,
to in med school or
mhm,
residency
mhm,
about metabolism. Right.
mhm.
And so
Yeah,
that's what's so hard.
yes. Yeah, and unfortunately, I mean, I think most people would agree that our training is biased toward treatment of illness rather than prevention of illness. And thankfully, we are now changing that. We're now more the medical students now are taught more about the prevention mode and not just treatment of a disease or a condition. And I just want to back up because when Ali said the BMI of 50, and we both kind of had an expression. So the BMI is the body mass index. And so a BMI of 25 or less is considered a healthy BMI for most people, right? And up to BMI of up to 30 would be considered overweight, or rather 29.9 is overweight, and then 30 and above would be considered obese. So a BMI of 50 is significant because it puts that person at risk for quite a number of conditions, not just affecting their heart, their high blood pressure, diabetes. It's just a whole host of conditions. And, it's unfortunate because there's also a social stigma
Yeah.
associated with patients who are overweight or obese. Often people will look and say, oh, they're lacking discipline, or they don't have any, or they're lazy, or, it's really quite unfortunate because, of course, looking at someone, you don't know what their body's chemistry, how that is playing a role in their appearance and their weight. And so we have to, until we expand the tools that we use to examine weight, healthy weight, overweight, and obesity, until we expand those tools, we're really not going to uh, change the epidemic of obesity in our society. So I'm really pleased that that your personal story has led you to do that. And so we do want to just remind everyone that we are encouraging patients to not just know their A1C levels, their glucose levels, their cholesterol levels, but also know your insulin level,
Yes.
correct?
Absolutely.
And if you're concerned that you may have insulin resistance, certainly go to your doctor, request testing of your insulin, because the truth of the matter is that most doctors are just not going to test insulin levels. That's just not.
And many might say no because they don't realize that that's even something that you can test.
Mhm.
And that it's not their fault. They just don't
Right,
know.
right. And hopefully you have one that is has an open mind and will be receptive to you taking an active role in being proactive in your health, which is really what we have always encouraged our listeners to do. And certainly if you're unsure if this may be something that is affecting you, um, we know that a lot of ladies, PCOS is one of the more common conditions that you'll see an association with insulin resistance. So if you have that irregular period, the excessive androgen levels as evidenced by your adult onset acne, or darkening of the skin, sometimes around the neck, around the navel or the belly button, under the breasts, you have that velvety appearance, and also excessive hair growth. If you find yourself kind of plucking your hair a lot, or hair on the back, right? Hair on the back is a really telltale sign in women. Most women do not have hair on their when I say hair on your back, we know that we're gonna
Horse
have
black
some
hair.
hair because we're mammals.
Right.
But excessive hair, you should not have excessive hair growth on your back. But certainly that is something that you can speak to your doctor about and seeing. And tell us a little bit about if you are diagnosed with insulin resistance, what's the next step? How does that correct it?
Okay, so I'm going to get my little line back out to talk
Go
about
ahead.
how to reverse insulin resistance. And let me start by saying it is not eat less and exercise more.
Okay.
You cannot tell someone who is always hungry and always tired that they need to eat less and exercise more. They're not going to be successful. And if you think about that poor woman who had a 72, her insulin is 72, she can be doing everything and it's not going to work because her fat storage hormone is through the roof and it is just gobbling up everything and storing it as fat. So it's time to stop playing the blame, and it's time to start understanding what to actually do about it. And I know because I've lived that life. I mean, 50 pounds heavier, I did literally everything and nothing worked until I had a priority focus on lowering insulin above everything else. I did not talk, I don't, in my whole approach, which is called a low insulin lifestyle, it is not about calorie or carb or fat counting. It is not about excessive exercise. It is prioritizing foods that do not spike insulin. Eat as much as you want whenever you want. That's truly what we did in our studies. Foods that spike insulin, avoid as much as you can. And that's the end of it. Okay.
Tell us a little bit about that. I need to get my paper out.
Absolutely. Okay. So first and foremost, when you have your insulin resistant cells, see, I've kept all these off. When you stop eating these foods that spike insulin and your pancreas isn't making as much, these cells say, okay, I'm feeling a little better now. I'm going to start putting these receptors back on the surface. It's that easy. That's literally what happens. They start upregulating their receptors again when less insulin is being secreted. When less insulin is being secreted, receptors go back on the surface, which means it's easier for glucose to get into the blood or into the cells. The pancreas doesn't need to freak out anymore. And generally, what happens is that over time, glucose levels fall, insulin levels fall. And that's it. When insulin levels fall, you're better able to burn body fat, which means you're not always tired because you have a steady supply of energy from your stored body fat. You're not always hungry because your body is using its stored body fat. I know it sounds so easy to be true, but it's our average weight loss by just following this was in our first trial, 19 pounds in 2 months. Our second trial was 18 pounds, and our third trial, which was an independent study, was 17 pounds during COVID. And that was compared to metformin, and the metformin group gained a pound. So this is truly by taking a priority of lowering insulin above all else. This is why it's so magic. So let's talk about what spikes your insulin.
Yes.
People think carbs, insulin. Yes, but that's a little bit, it's more nuanced than that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe you should count carbs. I don't think that it's not about carbs per se. It's about where you're getting them.
Mm-hmm.
So the good news is that you can eat all the non-starchy vegetables like broccoli and tomatoes and carrots and lettuce and, peppers and zucchini and all of those as much as you want. All the whole fruits, whole,
Mm-hmm.
raw or frozen, unsweetened fruits, not fruit juice,
Mm-hmm.
fruits. All they wanted. They could eat as much as they wanted.
Okay.
Here's where I wouldn't say bad news, but it's just understanding why.
Knowledgeable, making knowledgeable decisions.
Right. Starches,
Mm-hmm.
whole grain or not or processed, beans, lentils, potatoes, starches. All starches.
Oh no, lentils.
Let's talk about, well, and I'm going to talk about lentils in a second. Starches are concentrated glucose.
Okay.
More glucose means more insulin.
Mm-hmm.
More insulin means more problems. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, lentils are great. They have lots of protein. They have lots of fiber. They're great.
Uh-huh.
Lots of nutrients, but they also have a ton of starch.
Okay.
And you can get all of that protein and that fiber and those nutrients from non-starchy vegetables or nuts and seeds.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to get them in the starch-rich food. Quinoa, right? Quinoa. Picture of health, people think with quinoa. It's got lots of vitamins and minerals. It's got lots of protein and fiber. It's a great replacement for rice. It also has 36 grams of starch and a half cup. That's a lot of starch for somebody who really insulin resistance is glucose intolerance. You have a intolerance to having too much glucose. Well, you wouldn't tell somebody who has a gluten intolerance to go eat bread, and you wouldn't tell somebody with a peanut intolerance to go eat peanut butter. You can't tell somebody with a glucose intolerance to eat concentrated sources of starch. Okay. So that's the problem, is that if you were to eat a cup of quinoa versus let's say 15 grams of carbohydrate in quinoa versus 15 grams of carbohydrate in an apple, you're going to see very different insulin responses because starch is pure glucose and glucose is the primary driver of insulin. So no starches, as many carbs as you want from non-starchy vegetables and fruits. Sugar, of course, we all know that we shouldn't be eating sugar, but that includes natural sugar too. I mean, honey and agave nectar and maple syrup are pure concentrated sugar. More sugar means more insulin. Okay. So for those, we recommend things like sugar alcohols or stevia, things like that to sweeten instead of even natural sugars. The third one is non-fermented dairy. And I want to explain why. So patients could have fermented, right? They could have Greek yogurt. They could have small amounts of cheese. That was fine. Non-fermented dairy, I just want to explain. So people forget that milk is breast milk. All milk is breast milk, right? Whether it's from a cow or from a goat or from a sheep or from a whatever, it's all breast milk. Now, breast milk has three main purposes: to feed the baby nutrients because they don't have teeth, to give them antibodies from the breast milk, and then also the third is to promote growth. How do you think it does that?
Promote growth.
Raises insulin levels.
Okay.
It's biological purpose of breast milk, because breast milk and cow's milk actually have insulin in the milk and insulin growth factor. So that because a baby's newborn pancreas isn't mature. And so it needs to drink that milk to elevate insulin levels in the baby, because that baby has to triple its weight and double its length in the first year. So it's like if you were to take two babies and one, you just give it like the exact same nutrient breakdown, but you don't give it in milk. You just give it in like TPN, or you give it in another format. And versus milk, this one's going to be failure to thrive because it needs those growth hormones in milk or cow's milk if they're getting formula. So milk is biological purpose is to raise insulin and to stimulate growth. Well, if you are insulin resistant, the last thing you want to be doing is drinking insulin. You don't want to be doing that. It's going to raise insulin. And that's why so many people see that effect on their acne. I had severe acne. It only went away when I stopped drinking milk.
And you're
So
talking about animal-based milk, not
animal milk,
human-based
yes,
milk.
any type of animal-based milk.
Mm.
What happens when you ferment it is that not only does that insulin and insulin growth factor get kind of what's the word that I'm looking for? Denatured, right? It's just a hormone. It's denatured in that fermentation process. But most importantly is that not just does milk have insulin in the milk, but it also has proteins that are meant to stimulate insulin. All right. So whey protein is the most insulin spiking food you can eat.
Okay,
There
and
have
where
been
is that?
studies where they compare whey protein to a slice of white bread. What whey protein spikes insulin more than a slice of white bread. Well, that's a problem because whey protein's in everything. So imagine you're a poor woman with PCOS and you think, I'm going to start losing weight. I'm going to start exercising. I'm going to start increasing my protein intake. And they're going to whey protein. And all that's doing is stimulating tons of insulin release. And that's a problem. So when you ferment yogurt, it kind of breaks down some of those insulin spiking proteins. It's to branched chain amino acids is that's causing that. And so they have a much less, they're more insulin friendly is what I say. So I will just wrap it up and say, in our studies, we've done 3, simply just this: you're going to eat whatever you want, however much you want, whenever you want of these foods that don't spike insulin, and you're going to avoid these foods that do. 55% drop in fasting insulin in 2 months, 25% drop in free testosterone, 2 months, no medication, no spironolactone, no metformin, no birth control pills. And an average 18-pound weight loss in 2 months.
Oh, wow. That is impressive. Well, we are so appreciative of all this knowledge from Dr. Chappell and in educating us on the importance of insulin and its role in our metabolism and our weight, our management of weight and maintaining a healthy weight, and also our education on foods that spike that insulin level and maybe working against your goal of maintaining and achieving a healthy weight. So again, we want to encourage our viewers to, if you're concerned about your metabolism, your weight, PCOS, prediabetes, ask your doctor to just add an insulin level to the laboratory tests that are being ordered, and also know those values so that you yourself can trend those each year or whatever period of time you and your doctor decide that you will test them over. So again, this is Dr. Dana Smith. This has been a podcast of Straight Talk with my OBMD. Our guest is the lovely Dr. Ali Chappell, the founder of Lily Health and lilyhealth.org, and the author of
Low-Insulin Lifestyle.
Low-Insulin Lifestyle. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening to another episode of Straight Talk with my OBMD podcast. To learn more about this topic, visit our website at myobmd.org. Subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on Facebook and Instagram. I can't wait to spend more time with you on our next episode of Straight Talk with my OBMD.